And we are on to Hunter. Next up is Nagrand Slam, which is a card that was previewed by a very intelligent, very attractive, very extremely competent World of Warcraft player who was the first level 70 on Ner'zhul. This card is really interesting. It's 10 cost spell, which is obviously not something that you usually expect to see in Hunter, so it doesn't go into obviously any of these aggressive Hunter archetypes, but it is 10 mana on an empty board that will actually just do 12 to your opponent because it summons 4 3/5s that can attack opponents' random enemies. That includes face. They can just go right there. The Cleft Hoofs are coming for you. You, right now. But yeah, this I think is a very powerful card. Obviously, very difficult to get to a 10-mana spell in a lot of Hunter decks. I feel like the fact that Zul'jin is gone is probably a good thing, because this thing coming back from Zul'jin would mean lots of damage to people's faces. But this is, I think, potentially extremely strong if you're able to play a Hunter deck that uses it with Kael'thas. You can, like, Kael'thas coin tracking Nagrand Slam 12U on turn 6. Very, very powerful. It does feel like it's very slow, given that Hunter doesn't have very many good defensive tools to keep themselves alive to actually get to 10 mana, and they actually don't have life gain, etc., etc. So obviously, if you actually get to that point, this is an extremely powerful card. But Hunter can struggle to get there, so I feel like you're only really going to see this mostly off of something like Kael'thas or like Puzzle Box or something like that. Next, we have Augmented Porcupine. 3 cost, 2/4 beast. Death Rattle, deal its minions attack damage randomly split among all enemies. So you kill the porcupine and spikes just fly everywhere. There are, a decent number of Death Rattle synergies as well as buff synergies, even like hand buff type synergies in this set for Hunter. This does feel like it's a possibly powerful card. At just killing your opponent, right? Like if you manage to buff this and they like AoE and kill this, all the damage goes face. It would be really cool to have this with like Deathstalker or Rexxar with some sort of big minion or something like that, and just like smash them, do like a ton of damage to their face. But yeah, I feel like this is a solid card for sure, and I feel like with the sort of Death Rattle Hunter tools that there are available in the set as well, which there are some. There are a number of interesting synergies with this, so I think this card is pretty powerful. Obviously not like hyper aggressive or anything like that. But it's nice to see, much like Nagrand Slam, some cards that go into Hunter decks that aren't just looking to blow your opponent up. Next up, we have Hellbore, a 1 mana 2/1 beast with Death Rattle. Give you a random beast in your hand +1/+1. So obviously, can go well with Porcupine or some of the other minions that care about their attack and such. Obviously, also works well with any sort of Death Rattle trigger things. This and the Porcupine go very well with like Terran Gorfine, who's a neutral legendary who was revealed fairly early on in the initial reveal stream. This is one of the things that Hunters really like is just 1-drops that apply pressure, right, and give you some amount of value. This is like kind of like a fiery bat or whatever. It is worth noting, I mentioned this quite a bit, that 1-drops, 1-drop 2/1s are in a much worse position if Demon Hunter decks are popular because of Demon Hunter's ability to kill them very easily with their hero power on turn 1, not even turn 2. So I feel like in Hunter decks that are able to pressure a lot and punish your opponent from attacking into your guys, that's probably okay. But again, something to keep in mind anytime you're evaluating a new 1 health minion. I expect at least early on in Ashes of Outland that Demon Hunter is likely to be the most popular class, and they're going to die right away really often. Next up, we have Pack Tactics, a secret, 2 cost, obviously, since it's a Hunter secret. When a friendly minion is attacked, summon a 3/3 copy. This feels very good with Death Rattles. Specifically, you like Death Rattle, put this with like Hellbore, even like get a 3/3 copy of Hellbore, pretty powerful. 3/3 copy of the Porcupine. Basically, any minion with a powerful Death Rattle, this is especially good with, because otherwise just like get a 3/3, right? But if you have a Death Rattle, you're getting a 3/3 and you're getting a special bonus with the Death Rattle from that minion, especially if it cares about having the attack, like the Porcupine. It is worth noting they still attack the original minion, and you get the 3/3 copy. So if they're like attacking to the minion, you get a copy, and then you send your copy to smash them too. So overall, I think this is a powerful card. I think this is a interesting addition to the Hunter set of secrets. And a lot of times when your opponent's like trying to like play around various secrets, this just adds like another thing for them to need to think about. and can make their sort of like brain melt a little bit more. And you know, add this to like Phase Stalker world, right? Your opponent has to play around like this off of a Phase Stalker, which can be really annoying if they want to like kill your Phase Stalker. Like, haha, well, I get another Phase Stalker, and now it's a 3/3, and it's going to be, you know, continuing to spew out secrets. Next up, we have Scrap Shot. Deal 3 damage. Give a random beast in your hand +3/+3. One of the various hand buff style cards for Hunter, and this, you know, feels a lot like a like Marked Shot, right? Marked Shot was deal 4 damage, which is obviously, you know, a medium amount, like a meaningful amount better. But giving a random beast in your hand +3/+3 can, you know, can be a huge tempo swing. Like Scrap Shot and like hit like, you know, a Tundra Rhino or something like that, or hit the Porcupine, and you know, suddenly you have a Porcupine who has so many of his spikes to just shoot out and smash everyone. So I think this is a powerful card. Some of the value of this card will depend on how good the damage is to minions. It's worth noting this is 3 damage to anything, not just 3 damage to a minion like a Mark Shot is. This is 3 damage to face. And Hunter, any time that Hunter has a card that can go to face, you need to be very concerned about it, because that's a good place for it to go, especially when you're buffing something which can then go to the face. So, you know, Scrap Shot you, buff my Tundra Rhino, everything face. Next up, we have Zixor Apex Predator, a 3-cost 2/4 rush. With Death Rattle, summon Zixor Prime into your deck. So 2/4 rush is a kind of weird combination of stats. This is good at board control of small things, but bad at killing big things. So I feel like the front side of this is actually fairly weak. It only really seems effective against like a zoo style deck. You know, obviously it can be buffed. And once you actually see what Zixor Prime is, which summons copies of itself, obviously wants to go into a deck that is buffing stuff in its hand, because buffing the initial version means that you can have a rusher that survives. Having more health makes the buffs on its attack more valuable, and then obviously with the Prime version, the buffs on all the copies of the Zixor Prime will end up giving you, you know, that many more stats. So both these want to play with hand buff style cards. Which is, I think, why it is a 2/4 to start rather than a 4/2. But I feel like that does make this more of a situational card to put into your deck. I don't know that I would just play this in a deck that doesn't actually also have hand buff type stuff. I feel like it's fairly weak in a you know, just sort of standard mid-range Hunter style deck that isn't playing those cards. So if there is a hand buff Hunter style deck that sees play, this feels like it's a very strong addition to it, but I wouldn't expect to see it elsewhere. Next up is Imprisoned Fellmaw. It's a 2-cost 5/4, dormant for 2 turns. When it wakes up, attack a random enemy. That enemy can be face. Important thing about Hunter, face. This card feels like it's one of the imprisoned cards that scales a lot depending on how, like, what turn you play it. You play this on turn 2. I think this card is actually quite powerful, because say you go first, you play this on turn 2, your opponent gets their turn 2, you get your turn 3, your opponent gets their turn 3, your turn 4, this wakes up and attacks something. This is going to be bigger than most anything your opponent's going to have in play by turn 3, you know, the beginning of your turn 4. But if you play this in the later turns, this goes way down in effectiveness, because they are, you know, much more likely to have things that this is not great at attacking. That said, any minion that can, like, you know, you can like kind of play into to like have survive AoE is interesting in an aggressive deck. You know, like, you could obviously play this out immediately and try and just get maximum damage with it, but also like playing this and then loading the board a turn that your opponent's going to want to AoE, it seems like it's actually quite effective, right? Like if you're sort of pressuring your opponent to AoE and then suddenly this guy gets to like wake up and smash them, that actually feels like it can be extremely effective. This is kind of like a charge minion that's just kind of delayed, right? Like, because most imprisoned minions don't get to attack the turn that they wake up. This guy does. Obviously, it's a random thing, but if you can, you know, set up a board state such that, you know, your opponent doesn't have great things other than their face, or doesn't have anything other than their face for them to attack, it effectively just gets to charge their face, and 5 damage for 2 is a lot. Next up, we have Mok'Nathal Lion. It's a rush battle cry. Choose a friendly minion, gain a copy of its death rattle. It's a 5/2. So this is obviously a very powerful card in any kind of death rattle deck. A 5/2 rush that can copy any of your death rattles. There's a lot of powerful deck rattles. My understanding is this is also the World Championship card for Lion, who was the winner of the Global Championship last year at BlizzCon, which is cool. But yeah, like imagine playing a Porcupine on turn 3, copying your Porcupine, attacking with this, rushing into something, just hitting your opponent in the face for 5 on turn 4. That's powerful. So obviously this has like a lot of open-endedness in terms of what death rattles it can interact with, but even just in the 100 cards that we we have in this set, this plus Porcupine by itself is a very powerful combination that does a lot of damage and clears off a minion, and I think has a lot of potential. So I think this will be a very strong card in 100 death rattle decks. And so far, what we've seen makes me think that that is a theme that's likely to be pretty strong in this expansion. Next, we have Scavengers Ingenuity. A 2-cost spell, draw a beast, give it +3/+3. This is an interesting card because obviously there's a number of cards that key off of their stats. Obviously this works very well with the Prime. This is, I think, actually very interesting. You could play Scavengers Ingenuity and play a fairly limited number of beasts. Any card that draws a specific subset of card from your deck. You could literally only have Zixor and Zixor Prime in your deck and play 2 copies of Scavengers Ingenuity. And the first one can draw you the Zixor. You get it killed. The second one draws Zixor Prime. Obviously, this is like a very, very specific thing, very, very narrow case. But that's a way you could build your deck, right? You could just play King Crush, and you'll draw your King Crush and always be able to attack your opponent for 11, which is just a lot. But yeah, it's basically, I think, just a very, very powerful card with a lot of flexibility. You can play this just in a beast deck, right? Any kind of themed beast deck that it's just draw a card, get +3/+3, powerful. You can play it in a deck that has a very limited number of beasts, so you have this very specific pool that you're looking to pull from and buff, and that is powerful as well. So it's a very straightforward card, but I think has a lot of applications, and I think we'll see a very significant amount of play because +3/+3 is very powerful. In terms of giving you just a massive tempo advantage, and obviously scales very well with a lot of things like Porcupine, for instance. Every card combos Porcupine. That's what I've learned. Well, speaking of a card that's powerful with a bunch of buffed beasts, Beastmaster Leorox. 8-cost 5/5 Battlecry, summon 3 beasts from your hand. So that's my buffed King Crush. That's my buffed Thunder Rhino. That's my other thing. So, explode you. This card seems very powerful, and specifically with the Ingenuity, you can piece together this combo of like Thunder Rhino and just other big beasts to throw into play and kill your opponents in one big attack. I think has the potential to be this sort of explosive combo thing in addition to just like a big board presence generator. Obviously, this doesn't draw itself, or you can't draw this with the Scavengers Ingenuity. And you can't really play this effectively in a deck with Master's Call. I think Master's Call is actually rotating now that I'm thinking about it, so that doesn't really necessarily matter. But it is a very powerful card in a deck that either is looking to just play a bunch of big beasts or is built around like a burst damage combination that you can set up with Scavenger's Ingenuity into this guy for just a ton of stats in a single turn and really end up sort of breaking the rules of the mana that you can play in a single turn. That's Hunter. We're done. Next up, we have Druid. We're joined by special guest Shiro, who is not an imprisoned Shiro. He is a free Shiro. He's not dormant. He only goes dormant briefly at nighttime, and then wakes up in a furious rage. When Shiro awakens, his trigger is to bork furiously until he is fed breakfast. Imprison Satyr, though, is a 3-cost 3/3 that's dormant for 2 turns. When it awakens, it reduces the cost of a random minion in your hand by 5. This is one of the cards that was revealed fairly early on, and I think this card is pretty interesting. Obviously, in any kind of ramp deck, this can be very effective. It is a pretty dangerous effect when you're spending 3 mana doing absolutely nothing, and drawing this card late in the game can be extremely weak. But if you're able to ramp out a very big, very powerful minion, this can obviously have a pretty huge effect in terms of swinging the board. Shiro looks like he is going back to being dormant. You want to go back to being dormant, Shiro? There you go. So overall, I don't think Imprison Satyr seems super powerful to me. It seems like it is a card that kind of has some very high highs but very low lows. And I think that most of the time, if you want to play a ramp deck, you are probably happier to actually just use actual ramp cards than Imprison Satyr, especially because when you draw this late in the game, it literally does nothing, unlike even a Wild Growth, where you can at least end up cycling it for a card. I guess it doesn't literally do nothing. You get a 3/3 body 2 turns later, but when you're actually in the late stages of the game, it seems like it'd be very, very weak. You can possibly try this with like a Malygos deck, and even in the late stage of the game, you play your Imprison Satyr, make it so that your hand only has Malygos in it to reduce. But that can take a very, very long time to set up. I do expect that if this does see play, it is in that style of combo deck that's trying to reduce the cost of a very specific card like Malygos. Next up, we have Fungal Fortunes, which is sort of like an opposite Book of Specters. Draw 3 cards for 2 mana, discard any minions drawn. I do think that despite Book of Specters seeing a lot of play in decks that had a significant number of spells, like current versions of Reno Mage, Fungal Fortunes is kind of in a different spot because decks that contain a lot of spells and few minions often have those few minions as very central pieces of their combo. So losing, say, a Malygos in your Malygos Druid deck is a much bigger deal than losing like even your Conjurer's Calling or Lunate Paka's Galaxy in a current Reno Mage deck. So I feel like this is going to only really see play in very specifically focused spell-based Druid decks. Because you really need to not just throw away your only win condition. It's possible that you have versions of Spell Druid that are not so dependent on an individual card like a Malygos that still have a reasonable number of minions that just use Fungal Fortunes because it's a powerful card draw effect, but don't just lose the game if you discard that one specific minion. So I think this card is quite good, but I don't think it's quite the exact parallel with Book of Specters that some people seem to be making. Next up, we have Germination. 4 cost, summon a copy of a friendly minion, give the copy Taunt. This, I think, is more appealing to me than the Copy a Demon card that we saw in Demon Hunter for a couple of reasons. One, Fungal Fortunes makes it more appealing to play spell-based ways of generating board presence if you are playing a spell-heavy deck. 2, the fact that it gives a minion Taunt does mean that is more effective with a wider variety of stuff, isn't just narrowly applicable to copying specifically a demon like the card in Demon Hunter. And also, Druid is a ramp class. Druid has a lot of ways to ramp out and get to play something and Germination it in the same turn, compared to something like Demon Hunter in terms of the consistency with which you're able to actually get your sort of combination together. So a bunch of card draw in the form of Fungal Fortunes and like spell-based ways to generate minions go very well together, especially when you're ramping out. Next up, we have Overgrowth, which is very likely one of the most important cards in this set, I think. 4 cost, gain 2 empty mana crystals. This is extremely powerful ramp. Obviously, Nourish used to be 5 mana with the option of gaining 2 mana crystals, which were full mana crystals, which is important, or drawing cards. This is just the mana crystal option, but obviously gaining mana crystals is very powerful. This ramps you, from 4 immediately to 7, which is a really big deal in your following turn. And the consistency with which you can ramp if you're including Overgrowth, if you have Wild Growth, you have Breath of Dreams, just a lot of ways to ramp out your mana in Standard. And I think that we're going to see lots of Druid ramp decks. Given the presence of Overgrowth, you can go even bigger than you can with any of the stuff that only really ramped you a single mana before. So I think this card is very, very good, and we'll see a whole lot of play. Next up, we have Ysil Windsinger. Your spells cost 1. 9 cost 5/5. This is very much like Aviana, which obviously made your minions cost 1. That was a 9 mana minion that became a 10 mana minion, got nerfed to that in Wild, thanks to the combination with Kuhn and just kind of going nuts. But yeah, in a world where you have lots of really big spells, like play this into Ultimate Infestation, it's actually not as powerful as it might seem, because you could obviously just do that with 10 mana anyway. And the fact that you can't play this into like Innervate, because your Innervate costs 1, makes it a lot less sort of swingy than it seems. I feel like this is a card that looks better than it is, even in a combo situation, because specifically of the fact that you can't really follow it up in the same turn with a bunch of additional mana generation, because it makes all your spells that cost mana, or spells that give you mana cost mana. So it kind of in a weird sort of bind there. You really need this to survive a turn. Like playing this into some big spell, you need to have this matter and survive the turn, or like your opponent having to react to it, costing them more tempo than they can afford in that turn, in order for this to really end up being all that powerful. Next up, we have Ironbark. 2 cost card, give a minion +1/+3 and taunt. Costs 0 if you have at least 7 mana crystals. So the mana ramp theme coming in here. And this is sort of an interesting card. It's particularly scary with like Kael'thas, Kael'thas into Ironbark, into something huge is a very reasonable play. More things that cost 0 make Kael'thas style cards that much more scary. This card is also just like, in the early game, okay, right? Obviously, Mark of the Wild doesn't see play at +2/+2 and taunt, but like this being something which you can play early that can later be a free spell, I think is actually very relevant. But obviously something that can be very powerful with like Wild Pyromancer in the late turns of the game with Gadgets and Auctioneer. Frankly, I'm pretty happy that Acolyte of Pain got holo-famed, because Ironbark, Acolyte of Pain, Wild Pyromancer in the sort of late turns of the game would kind of go crazy. So yeah, I think this is an interesting card. It doesn't really feel like a card that a ramp deck wants itself unless it's doing combo-y things, but we'll see exactly how it sees play. Next up we have Marsh Hydra, a 7-cost 7/7 rush. After the attacks, add a random 8-cost minion to your hand. This is a really interesting card because a 7/7 rush for 7 isn't like crazy stat-wise, but it giving you a minion in a ramp deck for your next turn is kind of a big deal. If your deck is full of stuff like Breath of Dreams, Wild Growth, Overgrowth, a lot of times you just kind of have your big thing and then you don't have enough other stuff to go with it. There's no like Ultimate Infestation in Standard right now or anything like that. So Marsh Hydra being a 7-cost reactive card that's also a threat that also generates another threat, it's kind of a combination of a bunch of things that a ramp deck feels like it is likely to want. Obviously, it's not itself like going to win you the game, but if your opponent like doesn't answer this immediately, you generating multiple big threats off of it, and that can be a very powerful tool to win a kind of attrition style game. So it's mostly a matter of being able to have enough stuff so that your opponent can't actually just like answer all your things when you're spending the rest of your resources on ramp. And crucially, 7 is a pretty key cost, because if you Wild Growth or Overgrowth rather on 4, you then hit 7. So that's like a flashpoint of mana that's actually going to be relevant. And I think part of the reason we see if you have 7 mana, you could also use this with Ironbark, to kill larger things and keep it alive so you can get more attacks in, because, well, you have 7 mana if you played this. So I actually think this card is much better than it thinks. Much better than it seems on the surface, because it's kind of all these things that a ramp deck wants. It wants an answer that it can ramp into, that also, gives you additional threats when you're spending your resources for ramping. Next up, we have Bog Beam. Deal 3 damage to a minion. Costs 0 if you have at least 7 mana crystals. I feel like this is another like very powerful and Auctioneer style deck card. And I feel like we very, very well may see like the Auctioneer Kael'thas style of Druid with like this and Ironbark. You ramp up and then you're like, okay, I get to kill your thing, drawing cards, and that feels like it's going to be very much an archetype in Druid. I feel like this is also like a card that I could see just playing in a ramp style of deck, because be able to kill things while playing your sort of threats once you actually start ramping can be one of the things that Druid can struggle with. Like if your opponent like makes a like sizable board and you're like, okay, I can kill one thing, they're like, okay, my other things attack you. Being able to play like your Marsh Hydra, Bog Beam something, maybe even Bog Beam 2 things to help like actually get tempo back and swing back toward you. One of the big problems though is that, again, like if you have a critical mass of ramp effects to get you to your big things, you don't have that much room for stuff like this in Ironbark unless your deck also has a bunch of card draw. So that I think is the biggest question mark to me as to whether this sees play, because in that ramp style deck outside of the like Auctioneer style deck, maybe this is just the same deck. Maybe it's a ramp deck that also has Auctioneer and looks to have the ramp effects into the big minions and then just Auctioneer to find your ways to end the game. Next up we have Glowfly Swarm, 5-cost spell, summon a 2/2 Glowfly for each spell in your hand. This is obviously a finisher style card for a Fungal Fortunes deck. And this could make a lot of stuff, right? It could be 5-cost, basically like make 5 2/2s, or even like 7 2/2s. And that I think is a very potent card in like any kind of swarm deck, any kind of deck, even like a spell-based like ramp deck in some capacity. This can just be a way that you aim to fight for the board sort of in the mid turns. The problem with that is in a metagame where like people are playing a significant amount of AoE removal, unless you have multiple waves of stuff like this that you're not necessarily going to be getting enough sort of threat from any given one of them. So you may need to be playing this in a deck that has like, you know, a bunch of other token generators like Landscaping Forest Aid type stuff. And in those right now, at least, those feel like they want to be more tree focused. So I don't know if that's necessarily going to, you know, be the same deck, but, you know, you could easily have a spell based deck that's like ramping out to some degree, using Fungal Fortunes, using Glowfly Swarm, along with a lot of the other token stuff in kind of a different shell. Next up, we have Archspore Msshi'fn, who is a 3-cost 3/4 taunt with Death Rattle, shuffle Msshi'fn Prime into your deck, who is a 9/9 taunt, who also summons a 9/9 giant with either taunt or rush. Crucially, I've seen some people mention you could use this in like Quest Druid and get, you know, 3 9/9s for 10 mana. It doesn't work that way, from my understanding. What it is summon a 9/9, give it taunt, give it rush. So you don't get the extra 9/9. It's just whether that thing has that keyword. So, you know, this I think is a just not really a card that goes into like an archetype per se, because it's just a you know, a reasonably sized taunt body early, and then, you know, a you know, big thing late. Obviously doesn't go into like an aggro deck, but it's not like you play this necessarily like it's like your ramp deck, right? You don't have to be a ramp deck to use this, because, you know, you at least are getting the small portion first, and it's just like, okay, well, this ends up being, say you're a mid-range deck, it gives you the small thing, and then you have the large version shuffled into your deck for later, which you usually won't get to until you have a bunch of mana anyway, because it has to be shuffled into your deck and then drawn again. So I think this is, you know, just a solid, just overall a solid card. Again, I don't really know necessarily where it goes. It could easily go into like Highlander Druid or something, where you're just looking to have generally solid stuff, you know, or really, again, kind of any deck that isn't super focused on a particular strategy. I wouldn't play this in, say, the Auctioneer type Druid deck that I'm talking about, because you don't want to have, you know, non-spell cards in your deck. You don't want to have things that you cycle into with your Auctioneer that you can't do anything with, but can be very impactful pretty much anytime you actually draw both halves. And we are on to Mage. First up is Incanter's Flow. 2-cost spell, reduce the cost of spells in your deck by 1. I've seen people talking about like, oh, play this with, you know, like they're like, you know, you can Pocket Galaxy early, you can do this, whatever. I feel like this is unlikely to be a card that you play in a deck outside of very specific combos, for a number of reasons. One, you know, it costs you a card. Mage is a class that draws cards pretty well, so that actually is like a you know, pretty less impactful restriction than in some other classes, right? Like Mage has obviously Arcane Intellect, you know, baseline, but with the removal of Acolyte of Pain and Research Project rotating out, you don't have quite as much just sort of card draw as Mage has had in the past. So using a card to just reduce the cost of future spells by 1 is, you know, pretty low impact, and especially if you draw this like after your opening hand, like say you draw this like turn 5, you know, like how valuable is this effect unless you are trying to combine to a very specific combination of cards that, you know, to spells that can win the game in like a single turn or something. It's very, very expensive. It also only impacts cards, spells in your deck. Doesn't impact anything in your hand, so it doesn't have any immediate impact. You could use it in a deck with like, you know, stuff like Cyclone or whatever, but it doesn't affect the cards you get off the Cyclone. So it feels like it's, you know, it's a card that's going to take a lot to happen to go right in order for it to be effective. So I don't expect this card to see that much play, even in like spell heavy decks. Maybe in the like only spell decks, this could be something that like, you know, is effectively their wild growth, right? But again, the fact that it doesn't impact the random spell that you generate, and that ends up being a significant number of cards in sort of their pool, ends up being, I think, a pretty big deal. And that is one of the things. It's not like your spells this game cost 1 less. If it were that, it would be insanely powerful, I think, because it impacts randomly generated stuff. But the fact that it only impacts the stuff in your deck makes me a lot less impressed by this, and makes me think that it's mostly going to see play in 1-turn kill combos, if those exist at all. Next up, we have Netherwind Portal, 3-cost secret. After your opponent casts a spell, summon a random 4-cost minion. This is a really interesting secret. Mage has gotten, I think, other than the sort of classic set secrets, and now and then a pretty powerful one, has gotten, I think, a lot of bad secrets, but this one feels like it's actually pretty impactful. Casting a spell is a pretty easy trigger, and, you know, 4-cost minion for 3 mana. Obviously, there's a lot of failure cases at 4 mana. You get like a Twilight Drake or something, but this feels pretty strong. You know, like in the current metagame, like this, even just hitting like the coin is, I think, one of the big things that makes this really powerful. If you go first, you play this on turn 3. If your opponent coins to try and catch up, they're now behind because you get a random 4-drop. So I feel like this is a pretty strong secret, especially given that it can go into any deck really. I think it can make like decent use of this because it give you something to just fight for the board when your opponent is trying to develop whatever it is that they're doing. Obviously, it's like weak in like control versus control or whatever, but so are a lot of other secrets as well. So I like this card, and I expect to see a decent amount of play. Next up, we have Imprisoned Observer. A 3-cost 4/5, dormant for 2 turns. When it wakes up, deals 2 to all enemy minions. I feel like I'm going to be saying this about a lot of the Imprisoned cards. This card feels like it is at its best when you draw it early. Shockingly, card in Hearthstone is better on curve than not. But this also is the sort of thing that feels like it maps out to be a lot worse as the game goes on, both in terms of the damage that it deals to your opponent's minions being less relevant in the later stages of the game, as well as the body being less relevant in the later stages of the game as well. That said, this is one of the most powerful things that I can like really think of doing in the early turns as a mage against a minion-based deck, because if they don't play into it, it's like, okay, well, now you have a 4/5 on an empty board, and if they do play into it, you blow up all their stuff. So I think this is a card that can very easily find a home, like a 1-of in Highlander Mage, of course. I don't necessarily think that this is like a card that you build around in any particular way. It's more like you put it in your deck and then you like play toward it. I do just generally, as mentioned with the other Imprisoned cards, like the play pattern of the Imprisoned cards in terms of giving you and the opponent ways to play into them. This obviously lets you like try and set up a board where going into your next turn, your opponent's like, okay, well they have to like play into because you played out some minions, they have to play some stuff, and it's like, okay, well you just zap them all with the Observer, and it can also like play this interestingly to like sort of set up into your other AOE's. Like I think that this is a card that strong players who have good anticipation of the key turns of a matchup and know the certain types of things that players tend to play at different stages and mana junctures. Like for instance, let's say you expect to want to use a like Flame Strike or whatever on a certain turn. It's like, well, if they're going to play a 5/5, I want to play my Imprisoned Observer to line up the turn that they normally play the 5/5, so I can my Observer wakes up and I can Flame Strike and it kills it without needing any extra mana or anything like that. So I love the Imprison mechanic. I think it's really cool and will definitely lead to some interesting planning and play patterns that I think will very much reward experienced and strong players. Interesting card, Evocation, legendary spell for Mage. 1-cost, fill your hand with random Mage spells at the end of your turn, discard them. This is a very interesting card for Mana Cyclone style decks that are like, okay, I want to just play a bunch of stuff. I would love to play this card in Quest Mage. Just, you play a bunch of stuff and it's just like, boom, here we go, we're going. Gives you, like, obviously it can be a lot more powerful in a hand or deck situation with Swords of Apprentice. You can just play out a ton of stuff. But obviously this can also just go very, very, very wrong. And give you just a bunch of expensive things or situational things. One of the interesting things about this is Mage has so many ways to generate random spells already that like you can get other evocations from your random spells. So like if you're playing a deck that like is looking to play into this style of game, you're very likely have like a lot of opportunities to do it. And yeah, this seems especially crazy with like Kael'thas, right? You like if you have Kael'thas, Swords of Apprentice, and evocations, like can you just like basically cast spells forever? It seems pretty powerful to me. So I don't think that this is necessarily going to be like a staple card in like a bunch of Mage decks. But I can definitely imagine Mage decks that like Crazy Quest Mage style Mage decks that are very happy to play this card, and I expect it to be very powerful in those decks and extremely powerful in a lot of other decks when you just happen to randomly generate it. Next up we have Star Scryer, a 2-cost 3/1 with Death Rattle, draw a spell. This is a sort of interesting card for a number of reasons. One, it's just a reasonable early game body for Mage that comes with not only value but specific value. Is something we haven't really seen that much of in Mage. It does have 1 health, which as a 2-drop is not only bad against Demon Hunter but like bad against other mages. Druids, etc. can die pretty easily, but the draw a spell part is obviously very, very powerful. You're getting specific thing from your deck. You could easily imagine this in like a deck that has like mostly minions and specific spells. There's no more Pocket Galaxy in Standard, so you can't like Star Scryer to always draw Pocket Galaxy kind of thing. But you could like Star Scryer and have like say you only had Pyroblasts in your deck, right? And your deck has like Star Scryers and Dragon Casters, and you're like, okay, well, my Star Scryer will always get Pyroblast, and I'll just Dragon Caster Pyroblast you kind of thing. But yeah, it's compare this to just like Loot Hoarder, right? Like Loot Hoarder is a 2/1 draw card. This is 3/1 draw spell. I expect to see a lot of play because both it gives you the specific selection of drawing a spell, so it has like all these scenarios where it can get you specific stuff or specific category of stuff that you want. Say every spell in your deck is like removal. It's like, okay, well, this is 3/1 draw removal spell, draw a burn spell, right? If basically every spell in your deck is like Frostbolt or Fireball, this is drawing you just like direct damage. So I think this is obviously going to see play because it's just a good combination of ability and stats, and I think also has the potential to drive specific deck building if there are like very specific things that a deck wants to draw. Next up is Font of Power. 1-cost spell, discover a mage minion. If your deck has no minions, keep all 3. Obviously, this goes into the no spell or no minion mage deck. Duh, just read it. And this is, again, the sort of deck that I can imagine maybe playing Incanter's Flow in because it's literally all the cards in your deck cost 1 less. This is, I think, actually pretty interesting because a lot of like spell-heavy decks, one of the challenges with that spell-heavy deck is like, okay, well, how do I win? And this is not only discover minion, it's discover a mage minion. So the fact that like mage minions, there aren't that many of them. Mage is a very spell-heavy class. And there are a lot of highly impactful ones, like Antonidas, like, the Prime, which we will get to the actual Prime and Mage in a bit. So this, has the ability to hit like some pretty high impact stuff. You can hit Star Scryer. Your spell-only deck loves to draw spells off of Spell Scryer. So I think this is actually, if there, obviously this is like one of those pretty obvious things. If there is a spell-only Mage deck, this is going to be a key card. Duh. It's clearly one of the payoff cards for doing that. But I do think that this is a powerful enough payoff alongside the other big card we'll get to in a moment to at least encourage me to want to try to build the deck, and could be enough in order for that deck to actually be powerful. Next up we have Apexis Smuggler, a 2-cost 2/3. After you play a secret, discover a spell. This card seems very powerful to me. There are actually a lot of good effects relating to secrets in the metagame at the moment. For Mage, there's already the Flax Mage, or Arcane Flax Mage. Flax Mage, Flex Mage, Flux Mage, I don't know. Arcane Fleur Mage. That deals 2 damage to your opponent's board off of playing a secret, and Ancient Mysteries or Arcane Mysteries. They're all it's Flax Mage. Flak Mage. Flak Mage, Flux Mage, Fleck Mage. I don't know. and then mysteries, whatever, ancient, arcane, they're all a mystery to me, but a lot of payoff for these secrets, and specifically with ancient mysteries, the fact that you can get secrets for 0 works very well with the smuggler and with the Flax Mage in order to get these additional values for cheap. So being able to play your mysteries and then play the Smuggler and the Flex Mage into a secret, get an extra card, damage your opponent's board, or depending on the matchup that you're playing, like which one you want to focus on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like even in Standard, there's a ton of ways to leverage secrets in Mage right now, and then obviously in Wild, there's a ton of powerful stuff for Secret Mage. I don't know if this is good enough to actually make it there. It probably isn't, just because everything else is so good that discovering a spell is just not that big a deal. But I do think that in Standard versions, being able to just generate a little bit of extra value does feel like it's likely to be good enough. And a 2/3 for 2, totally fine stats. And I definitely am going to be looking at playing this in Quest Mage in the near future. Next up, we have Astromancer Solarian, who is a 2-cost 3/2 spell damage. Death Rattle Summon, shuffle Solarian Prime into your deck. So, just a cheap spell damage minion. Obviously, lots of good spells to get spell damage on in Mage. But the Prime version he shovels in, Solarian Prime, spell damage +1, 7/7 for 7, cast 5 random Mage spells, targets enemies if possible. Why can't my Yogs do that? My Yogs always seem to target me with my Lava Bursts, me with my Fireballs, my opponent's guys with the buffs, but these are all Mage spells, and basically pretty much every Mage spell is a damaging spell, or like a spell that you want to cast on an opponent's thing. They're not like buffs that you want to play on your own thing, so casting it on opponent's opposing minions or your opponent, all very powerful. So this feels like a pretty powerful card, right? And frankly, the cost of putting this in your deck is extremely low. It's a 2-cost 3/2 spell damage minion. So I expect this to see like quite a bit of play. It doesn't feel like the sort of thing that's necessarily great in Control. Simply because you don't necessarily make great use out of the spell damage +1, and frankly, just a bunch of random Mage spells isn't necessarily that great if, you know, in those situations. But if you're like playing any kind of like burn-ish deck, I feel like this is, you know, like just a tempo style mage deck. I feel like this is a very powerful card. And, you know, I imagine it'll, you know, possibly show up in like Highlander decks anyway, just because it's a powerful effect. And, you know, you do have like a very, you know, strong like board control swing by just playing this and very likely nuking your opponent's board. Next up, we have Deep Freeze, an 8-cost spell. Freeze enemy, summon 2 3/6 water elementals. This feels like it looks fairly weak, right? It's kind of expensive. Freeze something, summon 2 3/6s. You're getting 2 water elementals for 8 mana, which is, you know, paying full retail for 2 water elementals, but you're getting it from 1 card. One of the big things this does, I think, is give a board presence generator to an all spell deck. It's also something that could be extremely powerful with like Kael'thas. You know, you can like Kael'thas, Ray of Frost, Deep Freeze. Boom, make a big board of stuff. Like, I think when I first looked at this card, I was like, oh, this seems weak. And then the more I thought about it, the more I was like, okay, well, I can definitely see homes for this, either with Kael'thas or in a, you know, a Font of Power, Apexis Blast deck, because, you know, it fills a role that those decks need because they can't play minions. It could be pretty powerful with Khadgar as well. Obviously, if you're playing, you know, Khadgar, Conjurer's Calling, you've lost Mountain Giant. But Khadgar into, you know, Mana Giant plus Conjurer's Calling or Khadgar Deep Freeze, pretty big things that can generate boards as well. So I don't think this is like a staple card by any means, but I can easily imagine decks that want this. And certainly it's a card that you're going to be very happy when you get off of random spell generations pretty frequently for you know, a deck that is looking for ways to actually end games, because this can do that. And last but certainly not least in Mage is Apexis Blast. It's a 5-cost spell, deal 5. If your deck has no minions, summon a random 5-cost minion. Remember Firelands Portal? Firelands Portal cost 7 and was really powerful. This costs 5. You can't play with minions, but it will blow up something and give you a 5-drop for way less mana. This is extremely powerful. Obviously, the question mark is, you know, how good is the deck that actually has this? And, you know, as I, you know, go back to Font of Power, you know, these are the 2 real payoff cards for that, you know, oops all spells deck. Is your Apexis Blast gives you significant tempo, Font of Power gives you value. And also, I think, you know, with Deep Freeze, again, you know, these are the ways that you can, you know, like aim to actually end games despite not having minions in your deck. So I know that all spell mage is something that looks appealing to me, in particular, you know, with the massive tempo you can get from this. And, you know, even alongside, as I was saying, Incanter's Flow, if you're playing all spells, Incanter's Flow does seem like it is a valuable thing, especially if you can play it early and then play card draw effects to just get massive amounts of tempo. Like if you play Incanter's Flow and then like Arcane Intellect into Apexis Blast their thing, you get a 5-drop on turn 4. This is just like, you know, just a ton of tempo that you're actually getting, and then finish them off with, you know, Antonitis you discover of a Font of Power or whatever. So I feel like this is definitely powerful enough to justify trying to build that deck. And so a lot of it just depends on how powerful is everything else surrounding it.